Good evening. Hi, welcome to University Bookstore. Thank you so much for coming out and supporting your local indie tonight. It's very important, and we're so grateful to see you all here. My name is Eileen Hart. I'm the events producer here at University Bookstore. We're very happy to be celebrating another Boys in the Boat evening. By now, I'm guessing most of you know what this book is about. But just in case, it tells the epic American story of the U.S. Men's Olympic 8-oar rowing team from the University of Washington. The story of these gold medal winners displays the courage and determination of 9 kids from working class families and their coach who never gave up in the quest to win an Olympic gold medal in Berlin in the desperate year of 1936. We are so pleased to introduce the author of this epic story that has captured the nation's heart. Daniel James Brown lives here in the Northwest. He's committed to bringing history to life in as compelling a way as possible. There is no doubt that he has done this with the Boys in the Boat. No one can read this without feeling powerful emotions of pride, admiration, and belief that anything is possible. The best thing about tonight is that we're celebrating the Young Readers Edition, making this story accessible to all ages. This book has sold over 16,000 copies in this store alone. I've never given anything as a gift, anything else as a gift in 2 years to anyone. So now I even have more options there. Please help me in welcoming Daniel James Brown.
Thanks, Elaine. This is great. It's so fun to be back here. We launched the adult edition of The Boys in the Boat here a little over 2 years ago to great fanfare, and that really was what kicked the book off, got it started, and it's just been an amazing ride ever since. So hold on one sec here. Sorry, I thought I had my notes. So it's really exciting to be back here to launch this kids edition. For 2 years, I've been getting emails from all over the country and actually from all over the world since the book's been translated into 14 or 15 different languages. And one of the things that comes up over and over in those emails is that people ask me if it's possible to have an edition for their kids or their grandkids or their students. I think a lot of people, grandparents and parents and teachers, have found that it's a kind of story that really resonates with young people, and that's certainly something that I've found to be the case as I've gone around the country talking about it. And there's so many life lessons in this story. So finally we've been able to answer that need, and we will see how this does, but I'm pretty optimistic that the book's going to take off and do pretty well. So when I talk about the adult version of The Boys in the Boat, I always start off by acknowledging this is a story, of course, that reaches its climax at the 1936 Olympics in Berlin. And most people, most Americans, I think, when they hear that phrase, 1936 Olympics, the first thing that comes to mind is naturally the Jesse Owens story. And with good reason. The Jesse Owens story is one of those stories that we keep alive, we tell to our kids, we put in our textbooks, we teach in our school curricula, because it's a story that helps define who we are as a people. And it reminds us of some of the things we value. Great individual achievement, level playing field, racial tolerance and understanding. I think what is cool about The Boys in the Boat is that it also, of course, reaches its climax in Berlin that same summer. I think it's another story that helps remind us of who we are, helps define who we are as a people. in some similar ways and some different ways. And one of the ways it's different is that the Jesse Owens story is a story of great individual achievement. The Boys in the Boat is a story of great team achievement. It's really about teams. And it reminds us that historically, at least, we've been a people that have been pretty good at building great teams and getting things done. And I think it's arguable whether that's still as true today as it has been historically. And I'll come back to that a little bit at the end. But for that very reason, it is, I think, one of the stories that young people in our schools and in our families will appreciate, and also will find helps define who they are when they call themselves Americans, what kinds of things they value, what we all value together. So, what's particularly cool is that these kids, of course, in The Boys in the Boat are just that. They're boys and they're kids, and they're right here in Seattle. So, before I get into the team stuff, let me talk a little bit about how I came to write this book. About 6 or 7 years ago, my neighbor, a lady I knew only as Judy, came to me at one of our homeowners meetings. And she introduced herself to me. And she said that her father was living under hospice care at her home, that he was in the last couple months of his life. And he would like to meet me. She had been reading one of my earlier books to him. And he was enjoying that, and he wanted to meet me. So I think it was the next day I went down and I met this elderly gentleman named Joe Rantz. And Joe was quite weak. He was 94 years old. He was on oxygen, and he was stretched out on a recliner. But I sat down next to Joe and we began to talk. And Joe began to tell me about his experiences. We talked very briefly about that earlier book. And then he began to talk about his experiences growing up during the Great Depression. And he had this amazing story to tell about being abandoned by his family, about being left to forage for himself in the woods out on the Olympic Peninsula, about having to poach fish out of the Dungeness River in order to feed himself, about having to work at odd jobs wherever he could find them, and about being all alone at the age of 14 on his own. And that story really got to me. That really affected me. But then he went on and he began to talk about how he came to row on the crew at the University of Washington starting in the fall of 1933, and how he and his crewmates had come together and formed this crew and wound up rowing against a German boat in front of Hitler at the 1936 Berlin Olympics. And as he was telling me this story, my jaw just dropped open. I just couldn't believe the scope of the story. And the thing is, as Joe was telling me this, I noticed that whenever he talked about any of the other boys in the boat, he would begin to tear up. And so I knew there was a lot of heart in the story, and I really wanted to know why this man, this grown man, was tearing up whenever he talked about those other boys in the boat. And at the end of that first conversation, I asked Joe, I said just flat out, Joe, can I write a book about your life? And Joe, I said that was the wrong thing to say. He immediately shook his head and looked down at the floor and said, no, I don't want you to write a book about me. I'll never forget this though. And he looked up and he had tears in his eyes again. And he said, but you could write a book about the boat. And by the boat, of course, first I didn't know what he meant. I thought he meant the Husky Clipper, this beautiful cedar shell that he and the others had rowed in. But by the boat, of course, what he meant was the boat and those other boys in the boat. And something even more than that, what they had all become together that summer in Berlin, that almost perfect thing that they had all become together in August of 1936 in Berlin. And so that's what I set out the next day to try to capture. And it turned into about a 4.5-year odyssey of researching, meeting the families of all the guys in the boat, and trying to do justice to the story. Now, for those of you who are kids here tonight, let me just very quickly tell you what the book is about, and what it's not about. On one hand, it's a book about rowing. Does anybody here row? Either adults or kids row? Okay, a few of you do. Well, there's one level on which the book is very much a book about rowing. I have to say, when I started working on this book, I didn't know the first thing about rowing. It was like, I thought, if anything, it was pretty dull. In fact, I still get emails all the time that start off, I almost didn't read your book because I thought it was about rowing, and really, what could be more boring than a book about rowing? Fortunately, they go on to say, wow, it turns out to be not boring at all. So it's about rowing, and it turns out, as I say, that rowing is pretty interesting, and I wound up being a really big fan of rowing. And I just want to tick off very quickly the things that I think are cool about rowing as a sport. For one thing, there's the extreme physical challenge of it. I mean, if you want a challenge, get in a boat with a bunch of other people and learn to row, because it is unlike anything else you'll ever do. It will test you in every conceivable way. It's a very demanding sport. When you row, particularly when you row on an 8 or a 4 with a bunch of other people, you use every muscle in your body. You will be required to have a level of fitness that exceeds really any other kind of athlete. It will hurt at times, but it will also be enormously rewarding. It will require quite a bit of mental toughness, because rowing is a sport that demands that you keep at it, particularly out here in Seattle, where we row on Lake Washington all year long. And you have to get out there at 4 or 5 in the morning on an icy morning in January or February and row with ice in your oar locks. If you want to have to test yourself mentally, your mental toughness, again, rowing's a place to do it. It's also cool, though, because it is beautiful. Rowing is really a beautiful sport. And a great deal of that beauty comes from the amazing amount of coordination and synchronization and teamwork that go into rowing. And particularly back in the 1930s, when they rowed in these beautiful old wooden boats, they were really gorgeous things to behold. But more than that, a crew, when it finds its swing, when everybody is pulling together, it is really a lovely thing to see from afar, and an even more lovely thing to become part of. There's a long history associated with rowing. You know, long before there was college basketball or college football, college baseball, before there was any kind of collegiate competition in this country, there was rowing. The very first time 2 colleges ever met in an athletic competition was in 1852, I think it was. And I don't remember if Harvard challenged Yale or Yale challenged Harvard, but those 2 schools rowed a boat race, and that was the first intercollegiate competition in the country's history. And then there's also a lot of drama in rowing. You might not think so if you've ever just stood on the banks of the Montlake Cut and watched the boats go by. Sometimes those races are dramatic to watch if they're close. Sometimes they're not so dramatic to watch. So much of the drama in rowing takes place inside the boat. And one of the things I wanted to do, both with the adult version of this book and the kids' version, is put you in the boat so you understand it and experience it from the viewpoint of somebody sitting in the boat. So I'm going to read a little passage from the kids' version now, the young person's adaptation of the book. And it's a little different than the adult version, but I think it still conveys some of that drama and excitement. So what I'm going to read here is a scene from a race. It's the national championship in 1936. These kids from Washington, all of them from Western Washington, have gone to Poughkeepsie, New York to row in the national championship race. It's a really long race on the Hudson River. It's 4 miles long. They really need to win this race if they want to realize their dream and go on to the Olympics later that summer. Their coach, a guy named Al Ulbrichtson, is watching the race unfold from a train that's running parallel to the race course. And as we pick this scene up, Coach Ulbrichtson is terribly upset. He has told his coxswain, Bobby Mock, the coxswain's the guy that sits at the back of the boat and gives the commands. He's told Bobby Mock to row from behind, but never to get more than 2 lengths behind. For the first 3 miles, Bobby Mock has been holding his boat 4 lengths back, and Al Ulbrichtson, the coach, coming into the final mile, is just full of despair. But then something happens, and that's where I'm going to pick it up. On the train, someone called out, "Look at Washington! Look at Washington! Here comes Washington!" All eyes shifted from the leaders to the 8 white blades barely visible out in the middle of the river. Another roar rose from the crowd. It seemed impossible for Washington to close the gap. They were half a mile from the finish, still 2 lengths back. In the boat, Mock barked, "Okay, now, now, now." Don Hume took the stroke up to 35, then to 36, then to 37. On the starboard side, Joe Rantz fell in behind him just as smooth as silk, and the boat began to swing. The bow began to rise out of the water. Washington slid past a Navy oarsman as if the shell were pinned to the water. Cal's coxswain glanced over his shoulder. For the first time since he'd left it behind at the starting line, he saw the Washington boat sweeping up from behind him. He bellowed at his crew to pick it up. Mock hollered at Hume to take the Washington rate up another notch, and the 2 boats careened into the last 500 yards, storming down the corridor of open water between the spectators' boats. With the finish line looming ahead of him, Bobby Mock screamed something nobody could understand. Johnny White in the number 4 seat suddenly had the sensation that they were flying. Shorty Hunt still hadn't seen the California boat fall into his field of view, but he kept his eyes locked on the back of Joe Rantz's neck and pulled with his whole heart. Joe had boiled everything down into one action, one continuous movement, one thought, the crew's old mantra running through his mind like a river, not in his own voice, but in George Pocock's crisp English accent, "Mind in boat, mind in boat, mind in boat." On the train, Al Ulbrichtson stared silently at the scene unfolding in front of him. A Seattle sports writer began to holler, "Come on, Washington, come on!" Another sports writer shoved his paper press badge into his mouth and began to devour it. Tom Bowles was jumping up and down, beating the fellow in front of him with his lucky old fedora. Then, in the last 200 yards, pain suddenly came shrieking back into the boat, searing the boys' legs, their arms, their shoulders, tearing at their hearts and lungs as they desperately gulped at the air. And in those last 200 yards, in an extraordinary burst of speed, Washington passed California. With each stroke, the boys took their rivals down by the length of another seat, and by the time the 2 boats crossed the line, a glimpse of open water showed between the bow of Cal's boat and the stern of the Husky Clipper. Watching from the train, Ulbrichtson resumed chewing his gum. George Pocock threw back his head and howled. The sports writer removed the chewed up remains of his press credentials from his mouth. Tom Bowles continued beating the man in front of him with his lucky old fedora. And in the boat, the boys pumped their fists in the dark night air. When reporters approached Ulbrichtson, he stood up and said simply, "Well, they made it close, but they won." Then he added, "I guess that little runt knew what he was doing." So, and that's the moment at which these guys, I think, knew how good they were. That I only read part of the scene, but the nature of the comeback was so stunning that it really grabbed the attention of the whole sporting world. This Poughkeepsie race was a big deal. I mean, every sports writer in the country was in Poughkeepsie for these races. They were covered live, coast to coast on radio. And that was really the moment at which the country sat up and took notice of these kids from Western Washington, and it began to look like they really would go to the Berlin Olympics. So, a couple weeks later, they went to the Olympic trials at Princeton. They quite handily beat Cal, their rivals from Berkeley, and everybody else that entered the field, and they won the right to go to Berlin as Team USA. And we'll show you a clip here in a second of the gold medal race. But before I do, let me just sort of set the stage for that. The day of the gold medal race in Berlin, it was a windy, rainy day. The American kids, the kids from Washington, had turned in the fastest qualifying time, and the British boat had turned in the second fastest qualifying time. But they were mysteriously assigned lanes 5 and 6 out in the windiest part of the race course. The Italian boat and the German boat, the two fascist states, were mysteriously assigned lanes 1 and 2, which were sheltered virtually the whole length of the race course. On top of that, Don Hume, the stroke, the guy that sets the rhythm for the whole boat, sits right in front of the coxswain, had been sick on and off for weeks. And the days leading up to the gold medal race, he'd been running a high fever. Coach Ulbrichtsen really didn't want to put him in the boat, but the other boys went to Ulbrichtsen and basically insisted that he be put in the boat. Ulbrichtsen relented and put Don Hume in, as sick as he was, but he was a very sick kid as they paddled out. They rowed out to the starting line. There were about 75,000 people there that day, mostly German. Germany won the first 5 rowing events that day, the Olympic rowing events. They won gold medals in 5 straight Olympic rowing events, leading up to the 8-oared race, the big prestige event of the day. So the German crowd was whipped into a frenzy. They were chanting Deutschland, Deutschland, Deutschland. Adolf Hitler and the other top Nazis were up on a balcony looking out over the race course. And they were rocking back and forth with this chant of Deutschland. The boys rowed out to the starting line. They turned their boat around. They lined up. They're out in the windiest part of the course. And they don't hear when the start is called because it's so windy. They don't know the race has started till they see the boats to one side lurch forward. They dig really hard, but they're a stroke and a half behind right from the get-go. They row really hard out into the middle of the longer sea, this body of water. 1,000 meters down the course, halfway through the race course, they're dead last. Actually, they're tied with Great Britain for dead last. Bobby Mock, the coxswain, is sitting in the coxswain's seat. He's the only one looking forward. Waves are breaking over the bow of his boat, and he's watching Germany and Italy streak down lanes 1 and 2 toward what seemed to be inevitable gold and silver medal finishes. That is not how it ends. We're going to show you how it ends. I need to tell you before we do this that you aren't going to see the Americans when they're in the terrible state I just explained. You're not going to see them till the very near the end of the film. When you see them, they'll be at the very top of your screen.
Die Entscheidung im Achter. Schweiz, Ungarn, England, Amerika, Italien und Deutschland. Zum ersten Mal bei den Olympischen Spielen hat sich ein deutscher Achter bis zur Entscheidung durchgekämpft.
That's Italy there in the near lane, actually lane 2.
Italien kommt auf.
Germany, you'll see in just a second, is in lane 1.
Deutschland greift an.
There's Germany right there.
Deutschland holt auf. Zieht gleich. Die Wikinger gehen in Führung.
This is Leni Riefenstahl's film. Those are the Americans. The Italians wearing headscarves. That's Bobby Mock, our coxswain.
Der Endkampf ist entbrannt. Die letzten 100 Meter. Das deutsche Boot im
Germany and Italy here in the foreground.
Stirntuch die Italiener. Dahinter die Ungarn. Neben diesen England.
Up at the top of the screen are the Americans.
Deutschland kommt auf. Meter um Meter.
They've come from dead last.
Zu spät. Amerika hat gesiegt. Erster Amerika. Zweiter Italien. Dritter Deutschland.
Nobody knew for a while who had won until they made the announcement. That's Bob Mock, Don Hume, feeling better. Joe Rantz, Shorty Hunt, Jim McMillan. Yeah, so that's a fun film. So yeah, that's Leni Riefenstahl's film Olympia. Now that was, of course, this large documentary / propaganda piece that she made for the Nazis, documenting the Olympics, but also turning the Olympics into a propaganda, part of the very large effort to turn the Olympics into a propaganda event. And Leni Riefenstahl is a fascinating story. And there's much to be said about her. She was, however, a very fine filmmaker, and I think that film clip sort of shows you why. If you notice, she had the way she cuts in. Well, first of all, I should explain. All the pullback shots you saw there were filmed the day of the race. They didn't have cameras, though, in the boat the day of the race. So all those close-up shots. She got the Germans, the Italians, and the Americans the next day to re-row the race. She put cameras in the boat, right in the faces of the coxswains and some of the rowers. So what she then did is cut those close-in shots in with the long view shots. And if you notice, as the race picks up momentum, the cuts come more and more frequently, which is part of what gives the film its tempo and its drama. She was an absolutely amazing filmmaker. Anyway, that was the moment of the gold medal. So yeah, it's about rowing. But what I want to stress tonight is that this book is really about so much more than rowing, whether the adult edition or the young people's edition. This is a story about growing up. It's a story about dealing with family dysfunction, about family pressures. It's about learning how to trust people again when people close to you have hurt you very badly. It's about living through the Great Depression and the reality of what that was like, particularly here in Seattle. It's about what was happening in Germany during those years that the Nazis came to power. It's a love story about Joe and Joyce, who we met on his school bus and wound up marrying. And it's about what made these guys so very, very special. The qualities that turned them into champions, what made them a great team. And particularly for those of you who are young people who haven't read the book yet, I want to let you find for yourself what the answers are to that question of what made these guys so special. But I do want to give you some questions to think about when you're reading the book. Think about what kind of guys these were. What were their characters like? What did they value? How did they treat one another? How hard did they work? How hard did they play? Who influenced them, and how did those people influence them? What did they think was important in life? How did they treat each other? How seriously did they take what they were doing when they got into a boat and began to row? I think if you read the book and think about those questions, it will lead you to some answers that are worth searching for. Now, I want to talk also just for a minute about specifically what we did in terms of transforming the adult edition of the book into this young readers edition. For those of you who have read the one and are curious about what exactly this is different about this. First of all, it's considerably shorter, as you can tell simply by looking at it. It's 214 pages versus 370 pages for the adult edition. So we cut a lot of stuff out. But what we cut out was stuff that was relatively esoteric. Socioeconomic conditions leading to the Great Depression, the inner politics of the Nazi regime, some of the details about how the Nazi propaganda machine worked in Germany. Those kinds of things. Quite a bit of the more technical and detailed stuff about rowing. You know, the stuff about what exactly the Washington stroke was like in 1935. What we did is we substituted, for instance, for the rowing stuff, we substituted diagrams of the book. We put a glossary in with some rowing terms. We added a picture gallery of all the main characters in the book to help the reader keep track of who's who in the story. We added a timeline. We added photos, particularly of Joe and Joyce when they were younger. We broke it into more chapters and shorter chapters. We reduced the reading level some to make it age appropriate.
What age is it? Is it young adult?
What the publisher is saying is 10 and up. But you know, I think those kinds of, in my limited experience with dealing with younger readers, I think that's very much a guideline. I know of an 8-year-old that is reading the book and is absolutely, totally into it. I think there are kids who are 12 or 13 for whom it would be appropriate too. So it really just depends on where the kid is in terms of, you know, his or her personal reading level. But it definitely extends the reading level downward. For the most part, I think high school students are going to be reading the adult edition. Kids not yet in high school will probably be reading this edition for the most part. The other thing I want to emphasize about the adaptation, though, is that we work very hard to keep the essence of the story intact, to keep the heart and soul of the story intact. You know, as I say, I get emails all the time. There's certain things come up all the time in these emails. And one of the things that I hear almost every day is somebody writes to me and says that they just finished the book and they have tears in their eyes. And I wanted the young readers edition to have the same kind of emotional impact that the adult version does. And so I work very hard at retaining that component of it. I think the heart in the story is much more important than, there's certainly history in there that's interesting and relevant and helpful, but it's the heart in the story that I wanted to make sure came through intact. So with that in mind, I'm going to close by just reading a few paragraphs from the prologue to the book. These words really are aimed at the reader of the book, so that is aimed at the young readers. And it sort of speaks to what I was just saying. I was addressing the young readers specifically here. At first glance, this may seem to be a story about a time and a place that is very different from the time and place you live in. After all, the young men at the center of this story dressed very differently from you and your friends. They talked differently. They drove cars that look now as if they belong in museums. They sang songs that sound corny to our modern ears. They thought a radio was a marvel of modern technology. They lived through world events that now seem almost like ancient history. But here's the thing. The boys in the boat were just that. They were boys. The problems they wrestled with were the same that you and your friends likely wrestle with today. Family problems, making the team, succeeding at school, fitting in with other kids, learning whom you can and can't trust, finding a way to make some money, figuring out how you feel about the opposite sex, deciding who and what you want to be a few years down the road. Under the surface, they really weren't all that different from you. None of that is really what all those young people who come up to me at book events want to talk about, though. What they see in the story and what they want to share with me is the sheer excitement of being young, having a goal, striving to accomplish that goal, and making it happen. Just as the boys in the boat did, sometimes they talk about their Sometimes they talk about their volleyball team winning the regionals. Sometimes they talk about making first violin in the school orchestra. Sometimes they talk about wanting to be first in their family to go to college. Sometimes they talk about falling short of their goal, but being inspired by the book to try again. It's easy for those of us who are older and count ourselves wise to forget that it is the young who most often move the world forward. It is the young who have the boundless energy, passion, optimism, courage, and idealism to try to do what we elders might say is impossible. That's what the boys in the boat attempted to do in this story. That's why 80 years later at my book signing table, old men and women come up to me with tears in their eyes, proudly remembering when they were young and full of fire. And it's why standing right next to them are young men and women with beaming faces, bearing tales of their own brave attempts at the near impossible. So, as you read this book, I hope you will keep in mind that at its heart, this is a story about growing up, about wrestling with hope and doubt, about dreaming big, about going for the gold. In that sense, it's really a story about you. Thank you. So I would love to take some questions if you have any, and try to answer them. Yes?
I have heard that the rights to the movie, is that true?
The rights to the movie have been sold. Well, we shall see. Very shortly after I sold the book to the publisher, the Weinstein Company bought the movie rights. Weinstein Company made The King's Speech, and they make these nice history pieces, which is one reason I went with them. So they first optioned the rights and then they exercised the option and bought the rights outright. So they have the film rights. For the last couple years, they have been working on a script. That's all I know, basically. I'm getting kind of tired of having to say the same thing at book talks over and over. I wish I knew more, but I just don't. They are working on a script. It looks like they're moving forward. I've got my fingers crossed. I have absolutely no say or control over what that script is or, what they come up with, but it'll be interesting.
We will, thank you.
Certainly. Yes? Yeah.
Did you ever feel daunted from the beginning that everyone was going to know what the ending was from the beginning? How were you going to create suspense?
Yeah. I decided early on that we were going to go down that road. The reader was going to know what happened by the time they were done with the prologue, if not before. And that certainly presented a writing challenge. There's several things. One thing is I discovered that each of the races along the way sort of had its own rhythm and its own drama that was inherent in it if I looked closely enough at what was happening in that race. And that helped. And something that helped very fundamentally was, I know they win this race and the race at the end of the book. You know it, but they didn't know it. And so to the extent that I can keep the reader in the mind of the guys in that boat and share their uncertainty with you, then that helps drive the narrative forward. So it was an interesting challenge. Yes. Yes.
What happened to the boy that was so sick during the last race?
I must have really messed up with this because I get this question a lot. What happened to Don Hume, the stroke who was so terribly sick? I get really upset emails all the time. Don Hume was very sick. I found out after the book was done, he had apparently worked in a pulp mill up in Anacortes as a teenager, and the fumes in the mill, I don't know if it's sulfuric acid or whatever, but the fumes in the mill had damaged the linings of his lung and made him very susceptible to respiratory infections that would then turn into pneumonia. So that is presumably what he had. This was just a year or two before the advent of the first antibiotics. So there wasn't really anything anybody could do for those kinds of infections except rest and fluids, which is what they gave Don Hume. So he was very sick. He seems to have recovered quite quickly after the race because what I do know from his journal is that a couple days after the race he was in central Berlin drinking beer and chasing Frauleins. So I think the gold medal had a curative effect on him. Anyway, he was fine. He was fine. Went on with a long, happy, healthy life. Yes.
Having written a children's book now, do you plan any school outreach or activities? Has that come on the
School
cards yet?
outreach? Yeah, I will be going to some schools actually back east later this month, and we'll be doing a fair amount of that. I'm trying to balance a number of things. One is getting on with writing another book, with going out and doing outreach and talking. So I'm not quite sure how much of that I'm going to do, but we're going to do some. Hey, Chris.
How long did it take you to write the book, and how many drafts did you do?
So it took me, from the time I met Joe that first day till we had a finished book in hand, was about 4.5 years. I think probably about 3.5 of that was research and writing. And of that, I think probably 3 or 2.5 was research. In other words, the majority of it was research. I spent a lot of time at Suzzallo. Spent a lot of time talking to the families of all 9 of these guys. Spent a lot of time going to the places where the story unfolded, and so on and so forth. So a great deal of research. The writing, the way I work, I tend to research the topic so thoroughly and then I break it into scenes. Once I know, once I've done the research, the writing flows pretty quickly for me. So the writing, sitting at my desk was probably 6 or 7 months. There was a draft I turned in. It was edited, of course. There was a revision based on my editor's edits, and then proofreading and all that, of course. But just one major revision of coming back from editing. Yeah.
So, Joe's brother, who really pushed him to go to UW, was probably dead at that point, right? So who did you see from his family, or was the brother alive?
Joe's brother was dead, yes. So bro. Joe's stepbrother, Harry Jr., Thula's son, was still alive. And so I spent 2 afternoons with Harry Jr. talking to him of all that stuff about the years in Squim, a lot of the stuff about the Thula and Joe at the Golden Ruby mine in Idaho. A lot of that came from Joe, and a lot of it came from Harry Jr. And that was a touchy subject because Thula was Harry Jr.'s mom. And so I asked him both times I met him, I went out of my way to say, Harry, why do you think your mom treated Joe the way she did? And both times he just shook his head and looked down and said, I don't know, I've been trying to understand that all my life. So
I thought she thought he was a bad influence on her boys.
well, I think, okay, there's lots of theory. I have my theory about Thula and why she treated Joe so shabbily. It's just a theory. But there were a number of things. One thing is she did find herself in a pretty bad, rough situation. She just had been brought up to expect something more than what she wound up with. And but I think part of what was going on was that there were only 2 things in that house that remained from Harry's first wedding. That was Nellie, his first wife's grand piano, and Joe. And Thula wanted to get rid of that piano and to get rid of Joe for the whole time they were together. So I think part of it was just Joe was a reminder of that earlier marriage. Part of it, of course, was it was the middle of the Depression. It was hard to feed one's own kids, let alone one's stepson, I suppose. It wasn't entirely unknown for adolescent boys to be told to go off to Uncle Harry's farm or to hit the road and find a job during the Depression. It did happen. It wasn't unique to this family, but it still was a pretty extreme course of action. So, yes.
Do you feel like sharing what you're thinking about writing next? Or
If I knew what I was writing up next, I wouldn't tell you. Fortunately, I don't know what I'm writing next. So it's not a problem. I've got 3 or 4 ideas. Writing one of these books, as I say, takes 4 or 5 years of my life, another year or 2 of going around talking about it, if we're fortunate enough to have that happen. So it's a big commitment. It has to be something I really want to devote that big a chunk of my life to at this point in my life. So it's got to be a really good story, a story I really feel strongly about myself. I get a lot of people send me, actually I do this at almost every talk. If you've got an aunt or an uncle or your own life story is interesting, I am all ears these days. There's a contact form on my website that just sends email to my desktop. So I'm listening, I'm gathering people's stories, trying to find something I really can fall in love with. Yes, back in the corner.
So I was curious, you present the storyline, the way I read it, as if you were actually writing it from the early 1930s. I don't know if that is your normal style. I just recently finished the book, but I was curious if your research had impacted your style.
Yeah, I mean, to tell you the truth, when I read a book, it's a total immersion experience for me. I mean, as I say, I spent hundreds of hours in Suzalo, for instance, reading on microfilm newspapers from the 1930s, reading the Seattle Times, reading the PI, reading the Washington Daily, reading national newspapers, all day, every day, day after day, week after week. My head was in the 1930s. And I wasn't just reading stories about crew. One of the things I wanted to do was I would just read for a random date in 1935. I'd read the Seattle Times from cover to cover because I wanted to know what life was like in Seattle in 1935, what movies were showing, and so on and so forth. So yeah, I mean, there's a sense in which you immerse yourself in the time, and then that becomes part of the fabric of the book, and that's the way I like to work. Yes, very quickly. I think we're going to run out of time here, but yes.
How much time did you have with Joe Rantz, and did you feel that it was enough?
That wouldn't. I wish there had been more. Joe lived for about 2.5 months after I met him, and I would dearly love to have spent more time with him. You know, he was getting weaker as time went on. I didn't want to spend too much of his time because he'd get tired. I was very fortunate in that his daughter Judy had spent the last 5 years or so of her dad's life literally following him around with a pad of paper and a pencil, asking him just incredibly detailed questions like, the night your parents drove away and left you in Squim, what were you thinking? What was the weather like? What kind of food was in the house? And so on and so forth. So between talking to Joe and then going back and going through all these copious notes Judy had, I was able to develop Joe, in a lot of detail. And it's really because of what the work Judy had done in preparation. Yes?
Did it seem like Judy had the foresight that she wanted this story written, or was this for her own, like she just wanted to know the history of her father?
The day that Judy came to me at the Homeowners Association meeting, I did not know this. She had been looking for a writer for years to write her father's story, and so she lured me down there with this business from reading my earlier book, and he really loved it. He had been reading the book, but it was a trap. But it was a mutually beneficial trap. I mean, it was I'm so blessed by the fact that I got to meet Joe and tell his story. So. Okay, well, thank you very much. I think they're going to set me up to sign some books over
Yes, right down
that
here
way.
next to that green cashier sign.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much.
I don't think I'm going to Exeter, no.